everyone, and welcome to the Debrief on ABC News Live. I'm Kimberly Brooks. Thanks so much for joining us. There's two major stories that we're digging into today. Those monster wildfires still burning in northern and southern California. So we're on the ground there with the latest information that you need to know if you're in that region. Plus, a big announcement on Sunday. The world's most wanted terrorist, the leader of ISIS, was killed. But first, the rest of your headlines.
California Congresswoman Katie Hill has resigned. She's stepping down after allegations that she had an affair with a congressional staffer. Hill had been facing a House Ethics Committee investigation. The EU has agreed to accept Britain's request for an extension to the Brexit deadline until the end of January.
We're learning more about this terrifying scene here. Two window washers were hanging on for dear life in Edmonton, Canada. Their platform was swinging in the wind when one worker fell and was left dangling on Friday. The swaying platform, you saw it hit that glass building before emergency crews were able to send a bucket truck to rescue the man. The worker was able to hang on thanks to his security harness. This morning, both men are okay. Authorities say about 1 hour before this happened, a high wind warning was issued. A high-tech promotional stunt ended up crash landing in the front yard of a Michigan home. This is part of Samsung's Space Selfie high-altitude balloon, which looks more like a satellite. It was supposed to take people's photos and merge them with a photo of the Earth. The company says this was a soft landing and it was planned, but nobody told the people in rural Michigan.
So I looked out the windows and we saw it in the front yard. And we were just stunned. We just didn't even know what it was at first. It was flashing on the top and making noise, so we weren't sure what it was.
Another balloon carrying the device crashed into power lines a few miles away, knocking out electricity to that farm and blocking the road. Samsung says weather conditions resulted in an early soft landing in a selected rural area.
All right, we start with those massive wildfires burning out west. The worst danger today in Southern California, where winds are expected to pick up and last throughout the day. But there's still a monster burning in Northern California, and that's where we find our WILDFIRES, who's out there in Sonoma County with the latest. Will?
Kimberly, latest reports coming from the Kincade fire have it burning 66,000 acres and counting, and the containment number dropping from 10% to 5%. Hundreds of thousands of people evacuating the area. Healdsburg, Windsor, down to Santa Rosa, the 101 corridor there. Everyone fleeing, many of them to towns like Sonoma, down here about an hour or more south of the fire. Hotel rooms booked up, everyone fleeing, not quite sure where to go, but they packed up their essentials, their families, their pets, and they got going. When they return, they don't know what they'll be coming back to, but what they should feel comfortable knowing is that firefighters are working around the clock to protect whatever they can. Lots of this fire is up in the hills, uncontainable, uncontrollable. It's going to burn through whatever wilderness and potential structures it encounters there, because it's inaccessible to fire trucks, to engines, to hoses, to people getting in there to put out the fire. But what these firefighters are doing instead is focusing on defending the structures that are in harm's way that they can get to. All night, firefighters lining around houses, putting hoses on fires, on flames, protecting these houses. We spent a day with firefighters in a development in Windsor where firefighters were going house to house waiting for embers to blow in from the fire that was rapidly advancing on the community. As soon as these embers would blow in, they would rush to put them out. Sometimes an attic or a backyard would catch fire, but thankfully, due to these firefighters' hard work, no major structural damage. And that is hugely important, because while this fire is big and it's menacing and the smoke hangs thick, it blocked out the sun all afternoon for days. The smoke is in your lungs and in your nose. At least the fire is not getting to the people and their more developed communities closer to that 101 highway. So as that fire continues to burn, thankfully the winds here have died down. That's hugely important. That red flag warning in effect through Monday morning, but then a brief respite. Unfortunately, later this week, more winds expected, not only here in Northern California where the fires still could burn or new fires could start, but also down in Southern California as well, where wildfires are fire already burning, red flag warnings there. A trying time for the state of California, Kimberly.
Absolutely. Thank you, Will. Unbelievable images. And for more on where these things are headed, I want to go to Chief Meteorologist Ginger Z. Ginger?
Kimberly, thanks. How about we get to that forecast? All important for Southern California today, as the winds are going to be gusting to 50 miles per hour for some parts of the day through about 2 p.m. We've got some of the wind warnings up. The Getty fire was expanding, as were the evacuation zones this morning. That was all just west of the 405. This is a heavily populated and super pricey area in Los Angeles. So a lot of concern as these hills burn. The Santa Ana winds responsible, so those offshore winds going to stay with us today. You could see gusts up to 50. Anybody in the high wind alerts. San Gabriel Mountain Range, the San Bernardino Mountains, the Santa Monica recreation area, all included in that extreme danger zone. Relative humidity is low, and we'll get a little onshore flow and a little bit of moisture tomorrow, but then the cold blast in the Rockies brings offshore winds again for Wednesday into Thursday, and that event could be even worse than it was. Look at that, relative humidity down to 3%. You can see gusts up to 70 miles per hour. So there's the Santa Ana. Now look at this, Denver, Colorado. I talked about that dip in temperatures. Well, that storm that's already passed, giving you some rough commute this morning in Denver. I'm going to end up seeing that thing slide across the Midwest. Another one's going to come in behind of it. And this is looking like a more substantial storm from the plains up through Chicago. It could be a very cold rain on Halloween itself. I think you may need a poncho there over some of those costumes. I worked in Chicago for 5 years, Kimberly. It's not pretty when it's a cold rain.
All right, Ginger, thank you for the updates. We appreciate that. And guys, we're going to move to that huge announcement from President Trump on Sunday, the death of the world's most wanted terrorist, the leader of ISIS. So I want to bring in Louis Martinez at the Pentagon, and we have Ian Pannell, who's on the ground in northern Iraq. And Louis, I want to start with you. I just want you to remind us of how all of this went down and what do we know now?
That's right, Kimberly. It was a very risky operation that was launched late on Saturday night from northern Iraq, the Kurdish-held area of northern Iraq. 8 helicopters carrying about 100 members of Delta Force. That's the Army's elite special operations unit. They flew cross-country, all over the country of Syria, from one end to the other to get to Idlib province, and that's where they landed, just close to the compound where al-Baghdadi was located. The helicopters came down, and then the Delta Force members stormed the compound, but they didn't go through the front door because they were concerned that it might be booby trapped. So they went around it and they placed explosives, and then they went inside. That's where there was continued firefight that took place. We know that 2 of Baghdadi's wives who were wearing suicide vests, they were killed in the firefight. They did not detonate the explosives. And then there was continued shootout, and then the U.S. knew that there were escape tunnels in this compound. They knew that there were these tunnels, at least one of them had an escape area to get out of the compound. But Baghdadi went into one of those that did not have an exit, and so he was cornered. He brought along with him 3 children who were in the compound at the time of the raid, and he was now wearing a suicide vest. He did not want to be captured by the U.S. Delta Force. And so when he was cornered, the U.S. team had a dog that they typically bring on operations like this, and at that point he exploded the suicide vest, killing himself and then collapsing the tunnel. And then the U.S. team had DNA with them, and after about 15 minutes or so, they conducted an immediate DNA test, proved conclusively that that was Baghdadi. What happened next? The U.S. team spent about 2 hours on the ground collecting information, intelligence from either computers or thumb drives that could prove useful for gathering information about future operations about ISIS. After that, the helicopters then took off again, bound for the east of northern Iraq, and that's when they landed after that.
And Ian, I want to bring you in because I want you to talk about why this is such a big deal and what it means for ISIS, because they haven't been a centralized organization for quite some time now.
Yeah, I think that's right, Kimberly. Look, you said it yourself in the introduction. He's the world's most wanted terrorist. There was a $25 million bounty on his head. He led this group that was responsible for taking over a swath of territory from here in Iraq over into Syria, about the size of Great Britain. Thousands and thousands of people were killed. Still thousands of people are missing. Women, Yazidi women, taken as sex slaves. They raped, they pillaged, they took over property, and they're responsible for some of the most heinous crimes certainly ever recorded recorded and broadcast. We saw that with Western hostages. So yes, of course this matters. There will be many people who will be glad that he is dead. And we just spoke to the Kurdish Prime Minister, and he said, well, one less terrorist is a good thing. However, screech of brakes, it doesn't mean that ISIS is any weaker today than it probably was yesterday. It might cause them some disarray in terms of organization. Who will replace him? Will there be an internal power struggle? All those things will have an impact, but ISIS is no longer just geographically contained to this area. ISIS has become so much more than that. Because of the way that they use social media, ISIS has become an idea, it's an ideology. We've seen ISIS-inspired attacks. We saw that in San Bernardino, we saw it in Sri Lanka, we've seen it here in Iraq, Afghanistan, elsewhere. These aren't people who came here to train necessarily. They've seen the propaganda online, and that doesn't go away. They've got these franchises in Africa, in Asia, in Europe, elsewhere. That will continue to be a threat. And here on the ground, just one final point. The Kurdish Prime Minister made this point that since spring this year, there has been a 300% increase in ISIS attacks. ISIS is down, it definitely isn't out.
Yeah, so Ian, before I leave you, I want you to talk about the impact of the president withdrawing the U.S. troops and how that affected the raid that took place yesterday.
Yeah, and that was a question, again, that I put to the Prime Minister. The concern at the time, I'm not saying that this was necessarily part of the President's calculation, but we were inside Syria as the American troops were withdrawing, Turkish forces were starting to invade, is that you then have slightly ungoverned spaces, you have insecurity, you have a vacuum. And ISIS likes a vacuum. In other countries, it's the same thing in Afghanistan or in Niger, in Africa. It's ungoverned spaces, there's corruption, there's no real government oversight. ISIS thrives in that kind of territory, and that's a concern here of the Kurds, is that they will be able to regroup and launch more attacks. They don't control territory anymore, but in some senses it doesn't matter. ISIS began as a traditional insurgency, and that's where it's become again.
All right, and Louis, what does this mean moving forward for the security of the U.S.?
Well, as Ian just pointed out, the security risks are potential because ISIS can continue to inspire lone wolf attacks here in the United States and elsewhere around the world. But when it comes to Baghdadi, the question is, was ISIS so hierarchical that taking him out actually is going to impact the leadership plans for operations that they may want to do inside Syria and Iraq as they try to regroup and try to regain territory? What happens with those 11,000 ISIS prisoners that are being held by the Kurds? We know that the pullout affected some of them, that at least 100 were able to escape. So the question remains, will those 11,000 prisoners continue to be held by the Kurds? And ultimately, that's the security risk to the U.S. because if they go back out and are able to carry out their operations inside the region, they could potentially export it outside as well.
All right, Louis Martinez at the Pentagon and Ian Panel right there in northern Iraq. Thank you guys for the updates. And we're going to move to Washington, where the impeachment probe continues. National Security Advisor John Bolton's former deputy was set to testify and meet with investigators today. But now he says he won't talk until a judge rules on the White House's efforts to block his testimony. So I want to bring in Ben Gittleson, who's at the White House, and we have Ben Siegel on Capitol Hill. Ben Gittleson, I'll start with you. I just want you to break down what's going on here because this official, he was actually subpoenaed by the Democrats.
That's right. Charles Kupperman, as you said, was a former deputy to National Security Advisor John Bolton, who you'll remember left the White House amid acrimony recently. Kupperman had been subpoenaed by House committees, the Committee on Intelligence, Oversight, Foreign Affairs, and he had been scheduled to give a deposition today as part of the impeachment inquiry. He filed a lawsuit on Friday saying that the White House was trying to block his testimony, and it shouldn't be up to him to decide who he should listen to, the executive branch or the legislative branch, who said he had to show up today. So he asked a judge to make a decision and essentially tell him what to do. As of today, a judge hadn't ruled yet, and his lawyer sent a letter that said he's not going to show up until a judge does decide and tell him what to do.
Yeah, and how does this? What does it mean for Bolton testifying? Because they have the same lawyer, if I'm not mistaken.
No, you're absolutely right. Kupperman and Bolton have the same lawyer. It's likely that whatever a judge decides in Kupperman's case will apply in Bolton's case as well. The lawyer will likely give Bolton the same advice. And Bolton's testimony, if it were to happen, would be potentially explosive. As a former national security advisor during all of these events in terms of when Ukraine aid was held up, President Trump's dealings with the Ukrainian president, he has a lot of details that he would be able to share. So it's going to be closely watched what this judge decides.
All right, so I want to go to Ben Siegel on Capitol Hill. Something else interesting going on today. The former EU ambassador, Gordon Sondland, is back on the Hill to review his testimony. What does that mean, and is that normal?
Yeah, well, Kimberly, this is basically a procedure that is part of House rules. Whenever somebody gives a deposition, a sworn deposition, they have about a week to go back and review that transcript to see if there's anything they want to change and make sure they were taken down correctly. So this, in and of itself, is pretty routine. But just over the weekend, a lawyer for Ambassador Sondland, who testified before these impeachment committees, told the Wall Street Journal that Sondland testified before this impeachment committee that what the president was, his dealings and his efforts to pressure Ukraine into launching these investigations amounted to a quid pro quo. And that's obviously significant because that is something that the president and his allies on Capitol Hill have said he is not doing. So the fact that his ambassador to the European Union, a key player in this, his lawyer is now saying that that's what he testified to under oath is obviously a pretty significant development in all this.
And guys, before we go, both Bens, I just want you to give us a big picture on where we stand with all of this. It's a lot for everyone to keep up with, this back and forth and all of these testimonies. So Ben Gittleson, we'll start with you.
Well, President Trump, when he left this morning, he spoke to reporters on the tarmac before he departed for Chicago. And he actually said something interesting. He said, with regard to the impeachment inquiry, I'd rather go into the details of the case rather than process. He said, process is good, but I think you ought to look at the case. And that's obviously very different from how Republicans on the Hill have handled the impeachment inquiry in recent weeks. They've been making a lot of process arguments and, in fact, have deflected a lot when asked about the substance of the allegations against Trump. So it remains to be seen how their tactics may or may not change.
And Ben Siegel.
Well, the president might get just what he's asking for in the next few weeks. We expect public hearings for this proceeding, for this impeachment inquiry to move out from behind closed doors into the public as early as next month with any number of witnesses who can testify to what was going on between the United States and Ukraine in public. So the president will get a lot of conversation about these details in the public site, and it'll be interesting to see if the White House, which is so far refusing to cooperate, if they change their posture when this becomes a public proceeding.
All right, I want to thank you both, Ben Gittleson at the White House and Ben Siegel on Capitol Hill. Thank you guys so much. And we're going to move on to some sad news. Former Congressman John Conyers passing away at the age of 90. Conyers was the longest-serving black congressman, helping to found the Congressional Black Caucus. Conyers was one of only 6 black congressmen when he first won election to the House in 1964. All right, guys, so we're going to switch gears. Let's talk about the World Series. In the same 24 hours where President Trump announced the death of the ISIS's leader, he also made an appearance at Game 5 of the World Series in D.C. A variety of emotions in that stadium. At one point, the Jumbotron showed U.S. veterans on the screen, and they were met with lots of cheers. But then it showed President Trump, and he was met with a loud chorus of boos, and you can hear it right here if you listen. Yeah, smile on the face, but some people were even chanting, "Lock him up." So maybe not the kind of reception the president was hoping for. All right, so now we're going to move to the game itself. Houston dominating Game 5 in a 7-1 victory, and the series moves back to Houston for a crucial Game 6, with the Astros just one win away from another championship. So I want to bring in ESPN's Jessica Mendoza with more. Jessica, good to see you. What was the standout moment for you in Game 5?
Just to see a little bit of redemption from Garrett Cole. Remember, it was game one that he got the start, gave up those 5 runs, really struggled to put hitters away. Oh my goodness, was he lights out in this epic game 5 for him. And this is one of the best pitchers in all of baseball. He's going to be a free agent. I think he added some zeros to the dollar amount he's going to end up seeing because of the start he had. I also look at guys like Alex Bregman and Yordan Alvarez that were able to break out of these slumps in such a huge way. And that's scary for their entire offense if they're 2 hitters like that weren't strong that are now as strong as they've been.
And can we talk about Scherzer's injury? Do you think that's the main reason that the Nationals lost it?
Oh, that was huge. I mean, you got to think about Max Scherzer's their leader. I mean, I had him picked. If the Nats win it all, he's the MVP, right? I mean, he's their backbone. He's their everything. He had his wife have to help him get dressed. That's how much pain he was in because of the spasms in his back. And not just the fact that he didn't pitch, which was everything. I mean, him battling Cole, he beat him in game 1, but also the fact that he was just absolutely down, distraught. What that does to affect a team when your leader goes down.
And what are your predictions? I mean, is this over? There's, this game, it's very critical. What do you think Washington needs to do to get back in it?
They got Steven Strasburg on the mound game 6, and I have all my confidence. He beat Justin Verlander in game 2. This is another guy that'll probably opt out at the end of the year that wants to see some more money that he could possibly make. You look at that matchup, and I think this is going 7. The Nationals are not done yet. Plus, it would make history. You think about this. No one has ever won the World Series in the history of the World Series without winning 1 home game. I think the Nats want to make history and make that happen.
All right, a lot on the line. ESPN's Jessica Mendoza, thanks for being with us today. We appreciate it.
You got it.
All right, guys, and continue to take care of yourselves. And if you're around, you can stick around for the briefing room at 3:30 p.m. And then you can check out World News Prime at 8 p.m. And if you want to stay updated on all of these major headlines, you can go to abcnews.com or Roku or Apple TV or download the app. All right? And so I will see you tomorrow. Have a good one.
ABC News, straightforward.
What you're seeing right now, this is part of the eye wall. This procession of migrants